session in our series for this spring semester, The Other in Jewish Text and Tradition. I can't believe we finally reached the end, but as I hope you know, we have another wonderful series for the summer. I'll tell you about that again in a minute. But I do want to welcome anyone who's just joining us today for the first time. And if you're interested in seeing recordings of past sessions in the series, you can do that using the link in the email that you received earlier today. So we're really pleased to have Rabbi Daniel Nevins, who is the Pearl Resnick Dean of the Rabbinical School and the Division of Religious Leadership at JTS, and Senior Lecturer of Professional and Pastoral Skills. And his session is called From the Outside In, How a History of Marginalization Affects Jewish Responses to Marginal Populations Today. And I know that he'll be looking also at how marginalization has affected our identities as Jews and a whole host of other issues. So thank you so much, Rabbi Nevins, for teaching us today. Thank you so much also to our Tzaddik level sponsors today. Doctors Bonnie and Isaac Pollack have sponsored this session in honor of their children and grandchildren. So thank you so very much. And what a fitting honor for your children and grandchildren, who I'm sure are wonderful people similarly devoted to Jewish community and Jewish learning as you are. If anyone else, if you're feeling inspired by the opportunity to learn with JTS's outstanding scholars, we invite you to consider partnering with us by sponsoring a learning session in our summer series. There are 2 sponsorship levels, Chacham for $540 and Tzaddik for $1,000, and you can learn more by emailing learninglives@jtsa.edu. And thank you again to the Pollacks. So just a final word before we start for today. If anyone, for those who weren't able to join us last week, we're really excited about our summer series. It's called A Wandering People, Jewish Journeys, Real and Imagined. And I know that some of us will be tentatively beginning to travel again this summer, or maybe not so tentatively, but maybe not the kind of travels we've done in the past. And that reality kind of inspired us to do a journey about journeys through Jewish history, Jewish culture, Jewish text. So we'll put the description into the chat, but begins June 7th, and I'm really excited about it, and I hope you'll join us. I turn it over to Tani Schwartz-Herman to give us some instructions.
Thank you, Rabbi Andelman. Just to go over the Q&A once again, Rabbi Nevins will pause for questions periodically throughout the class. We'll also have a Q&A period at the end. You can use the chat feature to submit your questions to Rabbi Julia Andelman. During the Q&A period, Rabbi Andelman will select a few of the questions to present to Rabbi Nevins. For any technical or logistical questions, please initiate a private chat with myself or with Lynn Feynman. The sources for today's class were in the email that you received with the Zoom link for the session. We will also post a link in the chat. I'm pleased now to introduce Rabbi Daniel Nevins. Rabbi Nevins represents JTS on the Leadership Council of Conservative Judaism and the Executive Council, Joint Placement Commission, and Committee on Jewish Law and Standards of the Rabbinical Assembly. He has written responsa on the halachic topics of personal status, disabilities, bioethics, technology, and homosexuality. He has also authored several articles and chapters in books, and you can learn more about his many publications in his full bio that appears with his sources. I'm now very pleased to turn it over to Rabbi Nevins.
Okay, hello everybody, and welcome, Bruchim Habaim. It is so nice to see all of you there, and I hope that you can see and hear me as well. I also want to thank the Pollacks for their sponsorship. That is very, very wonderful, and appreciate all of you for supporting Jewish learning like what we're doing here through JTS. My topic I chose, weeks or months ago actually, and you never know when you choose a topic like this how it's going to play out in the moment. As it happens in this moment that we're living in, it's especially contentious. And excuse me just one second. I think, Tani, maybe you need to spotlight me. Is that possible? Okay. anyway.
You do.
Oh,
You
it is?
certainly come up for me as this in the speaker view, but
Okay.
maybe I'll
I was
spotlight you
just,
so you
I'm
see
just
yourself.
seeing you in the speaker view, so that's
You're saying me for some reason. Okay.
okay. All right, sorry. Anyway, so the truth, of course, is that we are living in a very difficult moment. I'm sure many of you have been following the news from Israel closely the last few days, and today in particular, there's been a lot of fighting in Jerusalem as the Muslim community is finishing up with Ramadan, getting close to the end of it at Eid al-Fitr, and the Jewish community is also approaching Yom Yerushalayim, which is a day of celebration of the Jewish people of the reunification of the city of Jerusalem at the end of the Six-Day War, and yet it's also been a flashpoint day of Jewish nationalism. And I actually remember many years ago, gosh, it must have been 35 years ago, I was a student, a yeshiva student in Jerusalem, and on Yom Yerushalayim, I remember dancing with the boys from Yeshivat Merkaz Rav Kook, which was associated with the settler group. It's not really where I'm at politically now, but I just remember how aggressive the singing was as we went through the Arab Shuk, and I know that that there's a lot of tension that's being introduced by Palestinians and Muslims, and also by some Israelis and Jews, not all for sure. And then Hamas, of course, doesn't want to be left out, so they're sending missiles or rockets from Gaza. Fortunately, none have caused any serious injuries that I've heard of, but it's a very difficult time, and it does illustrate this issue we've got of intergroup relations. To what extent is a Jewish sense of separateness, chosenness, there now I'm spotlighted, to what extent is that sense that we've got give us a sense of greater comfort and protection, and to what extent does our being separated from others leave us feeling more vulnerable? And so that's what we're going to look at. We're going to look at a number of texts from the Torah and rabbinic commentaries on it. Not just the Torah, we also have some other parts of the Hebrew Bible and rabbinic commentaries. And we're going to pause and we're going to ask ourselves, how do these texts reflect on how we relate to others, how our self-image has taken shape over the last 3 millennia, the biblical texts at our earliest stage, the rabbinic texts and medieval commentaries, and then our own sense today of how we relate to other religious communities, and frankly, even other religious communities within the Jewish people, because to be honest, the Jewish people has many different components, and we don't always see eye to eye or think of ourselves as really connected to each other. So with that as my introduction, we're going to look first at the book of Leviticus. This past Shabbat, we've read the last 2 portions of Leviticus, Bahar Bechukotai, and Bechukotai in particular has a long passage called the Tochacha, the rebuke, in which God sort of says to the Jewish people, look, if you do what I am telling you to do, then everything will be great. You'll be blessed and you'll be exalted among other nations. But if you don't do what I tell you to do, then you'll be afflicted, including by exile. There's a similar passage at the end of the book of Deuteronomy in Parshat Ki Tavo. And it's kind of interesting, actually. We always read these 2 rebuke sections right before a major holiday. We always read the rebuke at the end of Leviticus right before the holiday of Shavuot, and the rebuke at the end of Deuteronomy right before the holiday of Rosh Hashanah. But there's always one extra portion between, because there's a sense that if you were to listen to that rebuke and go straight into Shavuot, it would be a bit of a bummer. You'd be sort of suppressed in your joy. So we always begin the next book of Numbers before Shavuot. And likewise, at the end of Deuteronomy, we always get like 1 week of reprieve before we get to Rosh Hashanah, lest we go too full of self-doubt before God. But I want to say a word about Leviticus and how it compares to the book of Numbers, since we've now entered into the realm of Bamidbar, of Sefer Bamidbar. In a sense, the two books are similar. They're middle books, whereas the book of Exodus of Sefer Shemot is all about the grand drama of the exodus from Egypt, enslavement, the redemption, the splitting of the sea, the revelation at Sinai, the building of the tabernacle, all of that. And in the book of Deuteronomy, at the end of the Torah, is all about having arrived at the entrance to the land and the last preparations for going in. The books of Leviticus and Numbers would seem to be similar. They're both wilderness books that are very much about that in-between state, no longer in Egypt, not yet in Israel. And yet, if you think about it, those two books really are quite different. The book of Leviticus, of Vayikra, is a book in which interactions with other peoples are quite uncommon. In fact, the book is kind of, I think of it as the all by ourselves in the wilderness. It's like a camping trip book where the Jewish people, or the people of Israel really, are out in the wilderness with their tent of meeting, God in the middle of their tent, learning how to sacrifice, learning how to keep themselves pure, learning about sort of intra-denominational menschlichkeit, how to treat each other well, and how to repair damage when they cause it. There really is no relationship to non-Jews in this book. There's no narratives about how we interact with other peoples in the book of Vayikra, of Leviticus. There are references to non-Jews. In chapter 18, the beginning of the sexual purity code says, don't do what you did in Egypt or what the Egyptians did where you came from, and don't do what the Canaanites are doing where you're headed, right? But follow these rules. Right? So there's this sense of being differentiated from other peoples, but they're kind of kept at arm's length. And in the in some of the passages that we're about to read, there is a sense that you need to be different from other peoples, but there are no interactions with those other peoples. In contrast, in the book of Bamidbar, the book in the wilderness, Israel is on the move. They're starting to walk again, and as they move, they start to encounter other peoples. And as they encounter other peoples, they have conflict. That happens. Whenever there's transition, whenever people move from one area to another, they begin to sort of settle in and to squeeze out some of the other people, even if they're only passing through. They are threatening, and they are threatened as well. And so, whereas the book of Leviticus is a tranquil book, all the drama is internal of the Jewish people, the book of Bamidbar is very much a book of interactions with others. And the interactions, more often than not, are conflictual, as we'll see with the passage about Midian, the Midianites, and their attempts to use the prophet Balaam to curse the people of Israel. But there are battles with other peoples as well in the book of Numbers, right? So, so in Leviticus, we've got a description that there's this holiness code. And if you, the Jewish people, keep to yourselves and do things differently from others, then you will be separated from the other peoples, and in that you will have some protection. So I'm going to now turn to the text, and you've been given the handout, and you can open it up as a PDF, but I am going to screen share. I wasn't planning on it, but I'm going to screen share now, and in this way, we can look together, but I'm not able to see my screen share. Okay, so good. All right. So this is just the cover sheet. To be honest, this is a little bit out of date. I've published a bunch more since then, and I'm also nearing the end of my time at JTS, but I can tell you about that at the end. All right, so the first text group is what I'm calling Introverted Israel, from the book of Leviticus, and I will read it in the Hebrew and then go back over with the English. But you can follow along. If you don't know the Hebrew, just go ahead with the English. It says in chapter 20, Ushmartem et kol chukotai, v'et kol mishpatai, v'asitem otam, v'lo taki etchem ha'aretz, asher ani mevi etchem shama l'shevet ba. Right, so the first thing that we learn in verse 22 there is that if you keep all of God's laws and regulations, right, and do them, then you will not be spewed out of the land. So this is a distinctive feature of the book of Leviticus, that our purchase on the land of Israel is contingent. As we read, don't think that you are the real owners, that you've got title to the land of Israel. It's just a temporary thing. If you keep the laws, fine. Otherwise, you'll be spit out, just like the people who are currently living there. So when people have political debates, to whom does the land belong? To Israel, to the Palestinians? Well, I think the Torah's perspective would be the land actually belongs to God, not to any people. And any person or any group that is on the land is there contingently. And the source of their ownership has to do with their integrity and their righteousness. If they are a just and righteous society, then they have title to the land. And when they are not those things, they lose that title. And it goes on and says, verse 23, don't behave like the nation that's there now that I'm setting out before you, because these people have acted badly, and I abhorred them. Right? I said, you're going to inherit their land. I'll give it to you guys. To inherit it. Eretz Zavat Chalav Udvash. It's a land oozing with milk and honey. Right? Ani Adonai Elohechem. I am the Lord your God. Asher hivdalti etchem min ha'amim. And I, God, have separated you from the other peoples. So in other words, you'll only get to be in the land if you act differently from the people who are currently in the land. Just like the people who are currently in the land misbehaved and got expelled, so too with you. If you behave yourselves, you can stay in the land. If you don't behave yourselves, you too will be expelled. But it then says, I separated you. And now it goes on and it says, your distinctiveness is based in part on diet. You have to separate between pure animals and impure animals, which was the focus of one of the previous parshas in Shmini. And between birds which are pure and impure. It's kind of a rough expression, but don't make yourselves abominable, right, by eating these animals that are impure. If you eat things which I, God, have said are impure, then you yourselves will become impure, and you too will lose your purchase on the land. This is the perspective of Leviticus. V'hitem li kadoshim, be holy to me, ki kadosh ani Adonai, because I, the Lord, am holy. V'avdil etchem min ha'amim liot li. I will separate you from the peoples to be mine. Now, I want to point out that last expression. I separate you from the peoples to be mine. The idea here is not that there's an inherent value to Jewish differentness. That, Jews are the people who like Jerry Seinfeld. Jews are the people who eat bagels and lox. Jews are the people who have a different culture. It's none of those things. The thing about Jewish differentness, which the Torah is lifting up anyway, is the idea that you are the people who dedicate yourselves to God and to the distinctive way of relating to God that is the way of the people of Israel, which includes these dietary rules. So it's kind of interesting that from the Torah's perspective, Jewish distinctiveness is valuable only to the extent that it is connected to divine instruction. Anything else is not so valuable. So we see that, for example, in this Midrash. This is a late collection of Midrash called Midrash Hagadol. I believe it's goes back to the Yemenite Jewish community, sort of like a 10th, 11th century. So it's a fairly, almost a medieval period Midrash. But this is one of the sources used by Rashi. It says, "Va'avdil etchem min amim, b'shnei dvarim halalu huvdalu Yisrael min ha'umot." There are two ways that the Jewish people are separated from the nations. Ba'arayot, one is their sexual code, uvamachalot ha'asurot, and the other is their dietary code, what foods are forbidden. Niot li, what does it mean, you shall be for me? Im muvdalim atem min amim, if you separate yourselves from the people in these ways, harei atem lishmi, then you are for my sake, for my name. V'im lav, harei atem shel Nebuchadnezzar melech Bavel v'chaverav. Then you're like King Nebuchadnezzar and his buddies. Now, what does this text actually mean? I don't know exactly. What I think it means, though, is that the Midrash is imagining that, there are different ways to differentiate yourself. One could be based on ritual. And in that case, you, the Jewish people, have dedicated yourselves to God, and that is considered a valid differentiation. But if you're not saying that your difference is a religious difference, it's a pious difference, if it's just a nationalistic difference, then you're just like Nebuchadnezzar or any other king who is proudly in charge of a nation. And so I think what's going on here is that Jewish distinctiveness is itself being differentiated between a sort of a spiritual distinctiveness, which is connected to a ritual, versus a non-spiritual, non-ritual, non-theological difference, which is more of a nationalistic thing. And in that case, it seems that the Torah is not actually going to protect the people of Israel. They'll be like any other nation. They'll be on the land temporarily, but they'll be expelled if they don't behave. So I'm going to actually stop right now and take any comments. I've divided my presentation into 4 bunches of text. And so I imagine there might be some feedback on what I've just said. If there is, you can put it in the chat. And you can certainly feel free to disagree with what I'm saying and say that, no, actually, you think that Jewish distinctiveness is not about, keeping kosher or something else. It's really about, it's about our culture, or it's about our language, or it's about our family. And so do you want to push back at this sort of classic medieval perspective that those other types of distinctiveness are not enough to really survive as a distinct people on our land? Is there any comments there?
We don't have any questions in yet, and people might not have been expecting a break so soon.
Okay.
But if you want to ask a pointed question and open the chat to sort of crowdsource a response, I'm happy to do that.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to plow into my next set of texts, which is on the same line. And then once we finish that, we'll go into more of a discussion with you guys. But feel free to make any comments now that you want on the Leviticus text. So now let's go back and screen share again. And I have to find which one was it. Here we go. So this is the second text group. And now we've moved out of the book of Leviticus and into the book of Numbers, of Bamidbar. And now the perspective on Israel is not internal, the way it was in Leviticus, but external. We now begin to have a perspective of how the people of Israel are viewed by other nations. And they're looked at with alarm, to be honest. And so, so you've got this basically hitman who's hired, named Balaam. He's considered a prophet. The rabbis believe he was a great prophet, perhaps second only in power to Moses. And he's hired by this King Balak, who asks him to come and curse the people of Israel. And it's kind of a humorous story, to be honest, because Balaam seems to be torn. Like, on the one hand, he really wants to go because he's been honored by this king who's offered him all this wealth. And of course, who wouldn't want that? I remember one time I was invited to a White House meeting, and my mother, Allah Hashem, was still alive, didn't like that particular president. We'll just put it that way. And I said, Mom, I got invited to the White House. She said, well, you're not going to go, are you? And I said, yes, I'm going. It's the president of the United States. And this wasn't the most recent one, just in case you were wondering. And anyway, so sometimes, an offer like that from a king it's hard to turn down. And yet Balaam knows that God doesn't really want him to go. And so there's this back and forth. And Balaam gets on his donkey and he's on his way. And you probably know the story. It's one of the funniest stories in the Torah. The donkey keeps seeing this angel with a sword pointing at them and trying to stop. And Balaam is not seeing the angel, is frustrated and beating the donkey. And finally, God opens the mouth of the donkey and says, "Why are you beating me? Aren't I your loyal donkey? You've ridden on your whole life." And then finally, Balaam can see the angel. And the story is one that's very much about the humbling, you might say, the humiliation of a prophet who can't see what his own donkey can see. But Balaam seems to have learned his lesson, and he says to Balak, "Look, I'm only going to say what God tells me to say." And Balak's like, "Sure, no problem, buddy." And so he brings him. So here is the first real passage of what Balaam says. Vayisa mishalo, he picked up his theme. I don't know, the word mashal means an allegory or a theme. It could, however, perhaps be a staff of some sort. Maybe he had like a divining rod of some sort, and that he would lift up when he was trying to be prophetic. Maybe it was helpful to him. Maybe it was just meant to be very impressive. We don't know. Vayomar, he says, Min Aram Yancheni Balak Melech Moav. Right, so Balak has summoned me from Aram, that is from the east, and the east is understood to be one of the areas of where prophecy and frankly magic are understood to be. Meharare Kedem, from the eastern mountains. In other words, I come from this very dramatic and mysterious area to the east. Lacha Areali Yaakov, and said, "Here, can you curse out Jacob? Ulacha zo'ama Yisrael, and call out the doom of Israel." So he's a wizard, and Balak wants him to curse the Jews. And Balaam then says, "Ma'ekov, how can I curse? Lo kaboel, the one who's not been cursed by God. Uma izom, and whom can I doom? Lo za'am Hashem, when God has not doomed them." In other words, nice try, Balak, but I can't do anything here because God loves these people. Ki me rosh surim erenu, because I can see him from up above on the rocks. In other words, he was positioned up on the rocks. So the rabbis believe that the rosh surim, this rocky sort of cliff that he's looking from, is actually symbolic of the Jewish people themselves. I see them from the top of the rocks. Umigvaot ashurenu, and I see them from the hills. This is in the parallel structure of Hebrew poetry where they repeat the same idea. And then he says, "Him am levadad yishgon uvegoyim lo yitchashav." They are a people who dwells alone or apart. Uvegoyim lo yitchashav, and they are not reckoned among the peoples. And again, this is just parallel form. He's saying A and A prime. There are people alone. They're not counted among the nations. It's the same idea, just said in like mirror images here. So this is what he says. They are on their own. Mi mana far Yaakov, right? Who can count the dust of Jacob? When we spar at Rova Yisrael and count the numbers of Israel. Again, it's in parallel form, but here you can see it's sort of reminiscent of the blessing that God gave to Abraham, that your descendants will be like the dust of the earth and like the stars of the sky. And finally, he says this kind of sweet thing, Tamot nafshi mot yisharim utehi achriti kamohu. Right? May I die the death of the upright, and may my fate be like theirs. In other words, he's very clear that not only is this people not cursed, but they're blessed, and so much so that he would like to be part of them. And so let's look at two commentaries on this from the Middle Ages, and then I'll stop the screen share. I see there's one comment in the chat. I can't read it just yet, but I'll ask more of you to jump in on the chat when we finish. So this is the text from Numbers. Balaam tries to curse the people of Israel, instead gives them this blessing. And in his blessing, he says they are a different group of people. They're different from you and me, from all others. The question I'm going to ask, though, is that entirely a good thing? is this also still him trying to curse them by saying they're isolated, which we think of as a vulnerability, or is he saying they're distinguished, which we think of as a strength? Which is it in this case? Let's look at what Rashi has to say. Rashi, you know, is the greatest of medieval Bible commentators, Shlomo Yitzchaki, 1040 to 1105, born in Troyes, northern France. Anyway, in his commentary, he says, Kain am levadad yishkon. They are a people that dwells apart. Hu asher zakulo avotav yishkon badad. He says this was actually a gift that was merited for them by their ancestors, that they should get to dwell alone. Ketargumo. And here he's saying that's at least what we learn from the Aramaic translation, the Onkelos, which is the source, one of the sources of early Jewish commentary on the Bible. And he says, what does uvagoyim lo yitchashav mean? That they're not counted among the peoples? Ketargumo, also according to that translation, lo yu neasim kala imshar ha'umot. They will not be brought to an end, right, like other nations, right? So you think about it, other nations of antiquity, Pharaoh and his dynasty, the Alexander the Great and the Romans and the Babylonians, the Neo-Babylonians, all those different empires are done by the days of Rashi, but this people will never end. The word kala, which you may think of as like a bride, as a kala, means to be completed. It may also mean to be perfect, which is perhaps the etymology of why a kala is called that, because she's like Vayechulu Hashem Amaretz, the earth and the heaven were made complete, they were made perfect. But anyway, in this case, it's a negative, that the people of Israel will not be eliminated the way the other nations are. Einam nimneim im hashar, right? They are not counted among the others. Devar acher, and this one is kind of sad. Kishehem smechim, when the Jews are happy, ein uma smecha yemachem, no one shares in their joy. Shneimar Adonai badad yanchenu, because it says later in the book of Deuteronomy 32 and Nitzavim, I believe, God placed them alone. So the Jewish people is differentiated in a couple of ways here. First of all, that because God had a special relationship with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, so the people of Israel always get to be different from everyone else. Secondly, their distinction is that they are the eternal people, as it's been said, right? They're still going to be the last nation standing. And then finally, they're also alone in a less positive sense, in that when things go well for the Jewish people, other peoples don't seem to celebrate with them, but rather feel jealous of them. And we can discuss whether you think that's really the case today. So that's what Rashi said. Finally, I want to share one more commentary before we go to the question, the discussion. The Bechor Shor is another commentary that comes from about a century later in Spain. And he says, Livadad Yishkon, they will dwell apart. Klamar, Labetach Yishkon. It means that they'll dwell apart, meaning they'll be safe, right? So again, it raises this question, is isolation safety or is isolation vulnerability? It can be either of those. He thinks it's the former here. And he gives you, as an example, another verse from Deuteronomy, from chapter 33, Betach Badad in Yaakov, safe and alone, the eye of Jacob, or maybe the dwelling of Jacob. So in other words, maybe a people that's fully isolated, they can see everybody around them, right? Whereas if you're in a city that's all mixed up, then you really can't tell who's coming at you, right? So they're like in their rural redoubt, their mountain redoubt, and they really are apart from everybody else. Nobody can reach them. And Bechor Shor says about the last phrase, "Uvagoyim lo yitchashav, inam nechshavim k'shar goyim sheyachol adam l'klalam." The idea here is that you could curse a group of people. You could curse the French, you could curse the British. You can't curse the Jews, according to this, because perhaps they are scattered throughout the world, maybe. It's not clear what he means by this, and we'll see when we look at Esther, another interpretation of what it is that protects the people of Israel from Haman. So I'm going to end the screen share, and now I invite comments in the chat. The main question I want to ask you is, do you think of Jewish isolation, of Jewish separation, perhaps to use a more neutral term, as a source of protection? It's better to be on our own? Or do you think of it as a type of vulnerability, that we are exposed, we're not centralized, we don't have our sort of own neighborhoods? And you can relate to that in terms of the diaspora experience, for example. It used to be that in many cities, Jews began very concentrated in just one neighborhood, and they kind of spread out like in a funnel, a reverse funnel going outwards. Perhaps here in Manhattan, from the Lower East Side, moving uptown and then continuing north into Westchester and northern New Jersey, or continuing east to Brooklyn and Queens and out to Long Island. For example, when I was in Detroit, there was a very clear sort of northwestern trajectory of the people from sort of a couple of neighborhoods in Detroit before World War II to sort of an explosion to the suburbs to the northwest. And there is a sense of safety in numbers, but there's also a sense of people wanting to be out and mixing it up and not feeling that they are that they have to sort of hide in one neighborhood. All right, so I see just one comment.
So I got a ton of comments.
Okay.
We did just open the chat for everyone, but I have a lot of comments that came in the meantime also. If I can.
One I saw was Virginia, that there are those who see our being separate to Jewish snobbishness. So yes, any people that thinks of themselves as being different has that, and I don't think it's just that others think of it that way. There is something snobbish about thinking of yourself as being different. I think that's a fair critique. On the other hand, we do want people to feel that they have something distinctive to share in the world, and perhaps the valence, the moral valence you put on it depends on what the attitude is. Do you feel different in a way that I have something to contribute to the world that's really special? Or do you feel different in that I'm the only one who's smart, or the only one who's virtuous, or the only one who's good looking, or whatever, and everybody else has nothing to contribute? Okay, let's see what some of the other comments are here.
And while you're looking at that, I'm actually, since I did get so many comments before, I'm going to close the chat, the public chat, so that we can honor those who submitted already.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm just looking quickly at these here. Okay, so there's a comment: in my synagogue, we're engaged with immigration issues and Black Lives Matter. We feel safer being involved with non-Jewish congregations with which we share common values and engagements. Very nice. And I think that is the case, and it's not only about a safety thing, it's a sense of purpose, right? If you say that we are a congregation, or we are a Jewish community that is committed to values which are universal, that all people have the same, we hold these rights to be self-evident, that all people have the right to freedom and to pursue happiness, and then life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that when we see that another group is being threatened, whether it's Black Lives Matter or the attacks on Asian Americans that have been so demoralizing recently, and we say, okay, even though most of the Jewish community is not Asian American, some are, we're going to treat this as our issue, And because when one minority group is attacked, all minority groups are vulnerable, or maybe not even for an instrumental reason, just because it's the right thing to do to stand up against injustice. But it also has a benefit. I remember, and I see another comment here about everyone needs allies. How can being completely alone be good? Good. So, I mean, I remember when the Tree of Life massacre happened in Pittsburgh, and I flew out to Pittsburgh to visit some of the families and came back here. We had a vigil at JTS, and our friends from across the street from Union Seminary came, and including Christian leaders and Muslim leaders there, and they knew that we'd be there for them, and we're there for them when there were attacks on people of color in the city, and we were involved in marches, and they were there for us. And this is a way not only of feeling stronger and less isolated, but also feeling good, like we're standing up for goodness. And as liberal Jews, are we really better off being counted as part of society as opposed to our Haredi brethren who only allow themselves to be part of society when it suits them? Are we safer? So it's a question, and I'm afraid that this format, if we were in a room, we could everybody could speak up and share their views on this, because I'm certainly not the only one. And it's probably true that most people on this call do identify more with the liberal Jewish community than with the Haredi community, although I would imagine many of us have friends and family in the Haredi community. And you can certainly make the counter argument that they feel safer in their own communities, that they share a lot more in common with their neighbors, and that when they go out into a society in which there isn't immediate recognition of who they are and what they stand for, then they feel more vulnerable. I guess the question is whether we can go too far with our openness, and whether we lose something by not being separated. And so let's just
let me ask you, let me pose to you some of the comments that came in earlier, if that's okay. Because a number of people responded to, in a very traditional way, to your question in the previous break about what makes us distinctive, that it's our observance of the mitzvot, and that they don't separate that from our what makes us distinctive in terms of our ethical commitments and our spiritual aspirations.
Right. So you're saying that's a good thing. People were identifying with this perspective in the book of Leviticus, right? And in the Midrash that we read, that if the distinctiveness is a spiritual distinctiveness, then good. And if it isn't, if it's just that we're proud that we're different than other people, like a kind of Jewish nationalism, then that no longer feels so especially virtuous. But I guess some people would nevertheless differentiate within spiritual values. They might say, I'm okay with the part of the distinctiveness, which is our interpersonal obligations. If the Jewish people are distinguished by being Balei Chesed, that we are people who are doing Chesed and kindness for other people, that's something I'd be proud of. But if it's just that we keep kosher and we keep Shabbos on Saturday, not on Sunday or Friday, like our neighbors, then that doesn't feel like a good difference. I would say that the book of Leviticus and much of Jewish history would say that you need both, the ritual elements and the social elements. And arguably, the sexual code, which is problematic in a different way, nevertheless is an interpersonal code. It's saying, for instance, no incest or no rape or no adultery. And these are all things that they're kind of behaviors that break down the family and break down society. And so you need to be differentiated in that way, that you practice personal integrity and the way you relate to other people. And then the kashrut is a personal integrity in the way that we relate to God and control our own instincts, which are perhaps base and can debase us if we're not careful. So that seems to be the way that Judaism is describing itself. The Jewish people are being described as differentiated in a positive sense, not in a arrogant or nationalistic sense. Yes, so chosen versus superior. Yes, and there's very little in any of these sources that would say that this is better than other people. It's just saying that our relationship to God is mediated through these distinctive behaviors. Other people may relate to God through their own distinctive behaviors, right? But that's up to them to decide, right? We don't presume to determine what the right way to relate to God is for other people in the world, but we can say that our way of relating to God is through these distinctive behaviors. Rabbi Edwin, is there anything more that
I got a number of comments on chosenness, and one that I particularly liked was a frame of self-esteem, and thinking of yourself as special can be a form of self-esteem that has nothing to do with thinking of yourself as superior.
Right. One of my favorite children's books is I Love You, the Purplist. And it's a story about a mother with two little boys, I think. And her boys keep asking their mom, who do you love the best? And she's like, I love you, the bluest. And the other kid, she says, I love you, the reddest, and she has a description about what is really special about each child. And in other words, she doesn't say, I love everyone equally. She says, no, I love you differently. You are amazing at these things, and I just love you so much, and you're amazing at these things. And so I think that's kind of the Jewish concept of chosenness, is that that there are sort of special ways that we relate to God, the mitzvot specifically, and that when we do that, then we have a good relationship with God. And when we don't do it, we've got a bad relationship with God. And in a way, if my Christian neighbor eats a BLT, a bacon, lettuce, tomato, is that what it's called, sandwich, it really seems to have no impact on their spiritual life. Whereas for me, it would make me feel like I turned my back on a sacred part of my identity, and therefore distanced me from God. Now, obviously, not all Jews, many Jews don't feel that way, but it's the way that I've been conditioned to connect to God, is through, among other things, the dietary code.
Maybe just one more before you move on.
Right.
So a few people wrote in about kind of the dangers of separateness, and one person talked about how it reinforces the sense that we are other in other people's eyes, prevents people from knowing us. Another person actually compared it to interpersonal relationships and the way we sometimes isolate ourselves or create a barrier between us and someone else as a form of protection. And we all know that never really gets us anywhere in terms of kind of what we really want in our interpersonal relationships.
Right. So there definitely is a vulnerability of being too separate from others. And the Jewish people has experienced that many times, that we're seen as not only different, but as sort of almost demonic, and that's happened in certain settings. Something's wrong with the spotlight right now. But on the other hand, ironically, there have been times when we've been least distinctive, we've been least focused on our religious purpose, and where anti-Semitism has flourished. So if you think about it, in Germany, before World War II, in Hungary, in many other places where anti-Semitism flourished, in a way, it was a time when the Jews were bending over backwards to sort of suppress their distinctiveness and to show their solidarity with other Germans or other Hungarians or others. And so it's not always obvious that being different is actually going to cause friction. Sometimes it can actually cause people to say, oh, I respect that you have this difference. And in terms of the family part, well, sure, but we I think we all accept that parents are entitled to love their children and have more responsibilities for their children than other people's children. They shouldn't be harsh or indifferent to the needs of other people's children. We do have obligations to other people's children. If I find that I'm living in a city where there are children starving, I do have an obligation to try to protect those children and their health. But I think we would all accept that I first have an obligation to make sure that my own children are safe. And I think that's the best way to think of Jewish distinctiveness, as being like in familial terms, where we do have a special obligation to protect our own family, but that doesn't allow us to ignore the needs of other families. Did I respond to that okay?
Yeah, I think that we should, I know you have a bunch more text to cover. Why don't we go on?
All right, so back to the screen share we go. But I'm disabled from screen sharing right now. Okay, now it's back. All right, so text group 3 is connecting to what people were just saying about the dangers of being separated. And this is the horrible statement of Haman when he's proposing to King Ahasuerus that he destroy the Jewish people. And this little passage is one that has got many generations of Jews can recognize this type of slander. Vayomer Haman lemelech Ahasuerus, yeshno am echad mifuzar u'miforad bein ha'amim. So there is this one people, and they are scattered and dispersed among all the other peoples. B'chol medinot malchutecha, they're in all the provinces of your kingdom. V'datehem shonot mikol am, and their laws, or perhaps their religion, is different from all others. V'at datei hamelech einam osim, and they don't do the rules of the king, or maybe they don't share his religion. The word dat in modern Hebrew without an ayin, just daled taf, means a religion. This is the JPS translation, which doesn't assume that, but rather thinks that the word dat probably just means rules, right? Ulamelach ein shoveh lahanicham. It's not in your interest, king, to tolerate them. So in this sentence, or in this passage, Haman says to Ahasuerus, there's this people, they're scattered, which means that they're weak. But on the other hand, they're seeded throughout all your different kingdoms, which perhaps means that they are strong, right? They're different, right? And they are indifferent or even undermining, subversive. So they are scattered and subversive. That's the essential claim he's got. And there are many midrashim about this passage, but I thought most interesting was this Ukrainian rabbi, the Malbim, who's sort of an early modern rabbi. And I thought his reading was quite perceptive. He said, Haman deceived King Ahasuerus in 2 ways. First, he didn't identify who this people is that he's slandering. For perhaps if Ahasuerus knew about the Jews, that they are renowned as a wise and discerning people, he would not hear Haman's voice. So in other words, if Haman didn't come up and say, hey, King Ahasuerus, I've got a problem with the Jews, or we've got a problem with the Jews. And Ahasuerus might say, oh, do we? Because I kind of like them. In fact, maybe he even knows that Esther is one of them, although Esther was told by Mordecai not to tell anyone, but maybe he had his intelligence agents and he knew something, that old Ahasuerus, maybe he knew a thing or two. So the first thing that Haman did that was smart was he didn't reveal his target right up front. Maybe Ahasuerus liked other Jews. He definitely liked, as we know, Mordecai. And maybe he hadn't remembered yet that Mordecai had saved his life, but Mordecai's been around the court a bunch, you know. So first Haman just hid who he was slandering. Then he didn't reveal his intention to destroy them. For even if they were more lowly and despised people, Ahasuerus might not have heeded him. So if Haman had come and said, hey, king, let's get rid of the Jews, or even let's just get rid of any people, the king might think, why would I kill any of my subjects? Aren't they my responsibility? Or perhaps he might have said, that would be bad for my tax base. I collect money from and I don't like out of control violence, because when there's violence in my cities, it can eventually undermine my rule of law. Right? It makes me look weak as the king. And we know this from the Middle Ages, that, for instance, in 1390, when there were terrible anti-Jewish riots in Catalonia and Aragon, our professor Benji Gampel wrote a book about this. The Jews were under the responsibility of the king of Catalonia. And when there was anti-Jewish riots, it's not so much that he was just worried about the poor Jews and all how they were suffering. He was worried about two things. First of all, they paid taxes directly to him. And secondly, they were under his protection. And so when people attack his property in a way, the Jews were his property, it damaged his authority, and it also damaged his prosperity. And so Haman kind of hides from Mordecai what his intention is to destroy these people, right? So then how did he go about it? It says, but Haman was wily and said, there is a people not known well enough to recognize their name. In other words, oh, there's this little group, you don't even know who they are. And since he wanted to slander them and say that they were causing harm to all peoples, whether by their faith or their political conduct, and Haman knew that if they were all concentrated in one state, they could not damage other states. So, why does he say that they're scattered? Because if the king heard, oh, they all live in Muncie, they're all in Rockland County, right? Imagine that this is like Andrew Cuomo. I know he's not anyone's favorite right now, but let's say it's Andrew Cuomo up in Albany, and you say there's this one group. He says, well, where do they live? Oh, they're all in Rockland County. Well, who are they bothering? They're just living in Rockland County. They're all on their own, right? He might have said that, but no, they're scattered. They're all across your state, right? And or you could have said, well, they're scattered. There's a couple of them in Buffalo. There's a couple of them in Rochester. There's a couple of them in New York City. There's a couple of them in White Plains. Then he might have said, okay, they're concentrated. They're not affecting my whole country. But no, Haman says they're scattered everywhere. Right? And he says there's a scattered people. They have no state of their own, and they're distributed. They also don't have their own cities, but they're found in every neighborhood across the entire empire, and therefore they threaten all people. So the Malbim understands that when Jewish distinctiveness is paired with Jewish being scattered, that we are different, but we are not concentrated, then we are even more vulnerable. We're vulnerable in two ways. First of all, we don't have enough sort of concentrated power to protect ourselves. But secondly, our true enemies, people like Haman, will say they're insidious. They're everywhere, and you don't know where to find them. You know, and that is what's truly scary, that they could be anywhere. There could be a Jew attacking you anywhere. And so it's an interesting thing. Maybe the Malbim is actually mirroring or reflecting a Jewish sort of self-protection strategy, which is that we like to have our communities that are strong, because otherwise we're worried that we won't be able to defend ourselves, but we project onto our enemies that they will also be more threatened by us if we are truly scattered everywhere. So I'm kind of curious, and I'm going to read my last set of text in a moment, but you can put in the chat to Rabbi Andelman, do you feel that this is a true strategy, that the Jews should be sort of focused in a couple of communities around the country, or do you think it's better that we're truly scattered? And I will just point out that there's been sort of a refocusing of the Jewish people in a couple of cities, which is a reversal of a demographic trend from the 20th century. In the first half of the 20th century, Jews were, and really actually the end of the 19th century, Jews were scattering to little towns all over the place. Like I said, I used to be a rabbi in Detroit, and there used to be Jewish communities, not just in Detroit and in in Lansing and in Ann Arbor, but they were in Midland and Saginaw and Bay City and Traverse City and all these like little towns, and of course in Grand Rapids. And what was happening was that Jews were leaving those small towns. They were no longer in the dry goods business or in the hardware store business or in all the other sort of little shops that they had, but their kids were going to universities, becoming professionals, and living in the suburbs of major metropolitan areas. And not just within states, but even within regions. Like the city of Chicago seemed to be sucking dry all the young Jewish communities from St. Paul to St. Louis and Cleveland, and dragging all the young Jews into one or two towns. Is this a good thing, or does this leave us more vulnerable? Finally, I'm going to add something. Well, actually, I'm going to stop there, and then we'll come back together to a little happier text study at the very end. So does anybody go ahead, Julia?
Okay.
Yeah.
So a few people had written already about kind of the advantage of separation and how how Jews have survived largely because we kept ourselves separate, is where I was going with that. And I suppose you hadn't asked this last question yet, but I suppose you could argue that being scattered, it works in tandem with being separate, right? It's sort of not putting all our eggs in one basket. Talking obviously not about contemporary times necessarily. And one person gave the example of how in the South, that there was a lot of anti-Semitism when this person was growing up, and restrictive laws against Jews participating fully in society, that it created a very close-knit community that was a strength, but it was really by necessity.
Right. So the housing covenants obviously were a terrible thing, and the restricted country clubs and exclusion from certain business firms and law firms sort of forced the Jews to create their own hospitals so that their doctors could have jobs, and their own law firms and their own country clubs so they could play golf. God forbid they wouldn't play golf. And in some ways, those were reflective of a negative phenomenon. But on the other hand, they also sort of justified or reinforced Jewish pride. And of course, we're not the only ones who had this experience. And the New York Times magazine just had a great, few weeks ago now, cover story about African-American communities. I think the author was focusing on Chicago. And during the Great Migration, as many Blacks left the South and moved to the North, many of them moved to Chicago and Detroit and other northern cities where there were restrictive covenants that prevented them, redlining, from living in certain communities, which was a terrible thing, and it was discriminatory, and it caused poverty, and it caused a lot of negative things. And yet it also kind of allowed the emergence of a Black middle class, which then itself got undermined as with upward mobility, the Black middle class sort of left those neighborhoods, and they became sort of impoverished neighborhoods. And something similar did happen a little bit with the Jewish community, leaving some of the areas of greater concentration to the exurbs, and then leaving behind really only the poorest members of the Jewish community. And that actually led to some of the breakdown in intercommunal relations, because you only had some of the least resourced people who are Black and Jewish and other minority groups sort of stuck in these concentrated areas that were poorly resourced, and that led to a lot of stress. So yeah, I think that's a bit, I may have digressed a little bit from the question, but I think it's true that that when we've been sort of excluded from some things, it's allowed us to reconstitute. And arguably the state of Israel itself is an example of that, you know, most of the people who've immigrated to Israel have not immigrated from places where they were wealthy and protected. They've mostly left from places where they're under a lot of stress. Certainly after the pogroms, following World War I, when my family, the parts of my family that moved to Israel, they left Ukraine, after 1919. Obviously, after the Shoah, many Jews left. The Jews who left North African communities left in the 1950s when there was a lot of anti-Jewish rioting, likewise from Syria and Iraq and Persia and many of the other places that Jews were concentrated. So in a way, that pressure allowed the constitution of a state, which is a source of strength. And yet it also is a source of weakness, because now you've got large areas of the world that don't have any Jewish community. And we know that sometimes there can be anti-Semitism even without Jews, because we become this demonic other that nobody can say, oh, don't say that. My friend is Jewish. I know they don't have horns. I know that they don't all steal money. I know that they're not cruel, right? And they won't believe these things if they're more integrated. So that's the question. It's a bit of a dilemma that we've got. Do you want to share one other comment, and then we'll go into the Zechariah thing?
Yeah, there are a lot of great comments now. A few people just noted how we need critical mass in order to build the institutions that that create community and strengthen us. Let me just share one more thought with you. I'll put two comments together for your reaction. So one person was responding to the Malbim and said that she thinks that his point is that any characteristic can be turned against us by a wily enemy. Actually, why don't I stop there? I'll save the other piece for the next section.
Okay, yeah, well, I mean, I think this Malbim wasn't just coming up with this from nowhere. I mean, there's experience that people say, if we are too distinctive, then they say, look, they keep to themselves. And if we're not distinctive enough and we're sort of spread out, then they say, look how pernicious they are. They're everywhere and you don't know who's a Jew, right? It can be either way. We can be criticized in either direction. And so I think that being the case, knowing that being a Haredi community can lead us to be isolated and othered and be blamed for, for example, in the outbreak of COVID here in New York City, I think there is a lot to criticize in the way the Haredi community behaved. And yet they said, how come our community is getting criticized so much when there are other communities that are in public, the Black Lives Matter protests they would point to, or even that flyover that Trump had done in New York with the airplanes and everybody went out to see the airplanes going overhead. How come you're not criticizing them? And of course they were. So the Haredi community felt our isolation is what people are pointing at and using that to criticize us. And yet we know that when Jews have been most assimilated, we've also often been attacked. And so I think what's important is to look in the mirror and say, what kind of a person do I want to be? How do I want to relate to the broader society in a way that makes me feel good and proud that I'm actually supporting the prosperity of my fellow citizens who are different, and their dignity and their protection, because that's what my values say. In other words, I'm not protesting, against violence, police violence, let's say, because if I stand up for the Black community, they'll stand up for the Jewish community. And remember, there are Jews of color also, right? It's not that. I'm standing up because I think that if my government that I pay taxes to is discriminating against one group, right, then it's an injustice. And my job in the world is to promote justice, right? And there may also be some sort of diplomatic benefits to being known as a righteous community, but I'm doing it mostly for my own values. And likewise, my religious values, I should be standing up for them because I'm pious in this way. It's a commitment to God, not because I think I'll win the admiration of the neighbors. Was there something else you wanted to say there? Or shall I look at the last text now?
I have a few more good comments. Why don't we look at the last text and then we'll take final comments.
Okay, we'll do this really quickly again. I need the screen sharing ability restored. Good. So towards the end of the prophetic section of the Hebrew Bible, there are these minor prophets, we call them the Treasar, the 12. They're these 12 short books. And two of them we're going to quote from Zechariah and Zephaniah. Zechariah has this beautiful passage, Roni v'simchi bat Sion, shout for joy, fear Zion, ki hineni ba v'shachanti b'tochechnu madonai. Because here I come, I'm going to dwell in your midst. This is one of the great promises that we find already in the book of Exodus, that God, will build the temple and God will dwell in our midst. So don't think that I've abandoned you. V'nilvu goyim rabim el Adonai b'yomahu. And on that day, many nations are going to come close to God. V'hayu li la'am, and they'll be my people. V'shachanti b'tochech, and I will dwell in your midst. V'yadat ki Adonai tzvaot shlachani elayich, and then you'll know that the Lord of hosts has sent me to you. Now, the big question, I guess I'll finish the passage. V'nachal Hashem et Yehuda chalko al admat hakodesh u'bachar od b'Yerushalayim, and then God's going to cause the Jewish people to dwell in the land, and will also choose Jerusalem. Haskol basar mipnei Adonai kinei or mimon kodsho. Be silent, O flesh, before the Lord, for he is roused from his holy habitation. So there's a sense that God has kind of abandoned the Jewish people. We've been in exile, but now God's going to bring us back. We're going to go back to our land. God's going to choose Jerusalem. God has been awakened. But in the middle of it, there's this line, V'nilvu goyim rabim el Adonai. The word nilvu, the word livaya, you probably know, is a funeral in Judaism. Why is it called a livaya? Because you accompany the dead and the mourners to the grave. So the word livaya means to be to accompany. So many Gentiles will accompany or attach themselves to the Lord, right? V'hayu li la'am, and they will be my people. So this seems to be an expansion of the covenant, that not only will the Jews be connected to God, but our eschatology, our belief of the end of time, is that not only the Jews, but all people, or at least many people, will also join into the relationship with God. So is this a universalistic promise that the ultimate goal of Jewish distinctiveness is actually an expansion and an inclusion of all peoples? Or is even this an affirmation of Jewish distinctiveness? So let's look at one more of these and then some commentary. Ki az epoch el amim safa brura. Then I'm going to make all the peoples have a clear speech. Likro kulam b'shem Hashem. What does it mean that they'll have clear speech? Because they'll be able to speak the language of God. La'avdo shchem echad, and to serve with one accord, it says here, but shchem echad literally means shoulder to shoulder. It's this image of a future time when all peoples will speak the same language and do the same service in worshiping God, right? So here you've got these eschatological texts, these texts at the end of time, where the prophets declare that there'll be a time when the Jews and their Gentile neighbors will all join together and be God's people together. Or is it that case? The rabbis are not so sure. And here again, we come to our friend Malbim. He says, V'nilvu goyim rabim el Adonai, sheyitkayru. This means not just that they'll be accepted for who they are, but they're going to convert, meaning to Judaism. V'yikablu data emet, and they will accept the true faith. In other words, this is a conversionary vision. Uv'cholzot, and now he goes even more. Even if the Gentiles convert to Judaism, v'shachanti b'tochech, I'm still going to be in your midst. There's still going to be a distinction between original Jews and these add-ons. Hainu b'toch Yisrael, I'm going to still remain in the people of Israel. Kamoshi katuv, as it says, and I will walk in your midst. V'hitalachti b'tochechem bidatem ki Adonai tzvaot shlachani elayich. Then I'm going to walk in your midst, and you'll know that the Lord of hosts has sent me to you. Ki hashlichut hakodem hayala asir tagoyim. The first mission was to warn the nations not to oppress the Jews. If you know what you guys are doing, you should join with them. And the second one is to say, Jews, don't lose hope. Even if other people start to worship God, right, you'll still be special to God. So there's a book called Judaism and Other Religions by a scholar named Alan Brill, which I recommend to you. And he's a scholar of sort of interfaith studies, how religious groups think of each other. Is it true that Judaism is anti-Christian or anti-Muslim? Well, you could find sources that would prove that. You can also find sources that prove the opposite. For that matter, is it true that Islam is anti-Jewish? Well, you could find sources that say that, and you can also find sources that say the opposite of that. And likewise with Christianity. In each of these traditions, they are rich traditions, and they are sometimes contradictory. Christianity certainly has some texts like the one from Matthew about the blood of Jesus is on us and our descendants, which is a terrible text, which has caused a lot of suffering, a lot of anti-Semitism and a lot of suffering. But then there are other texts in which Christian scriptures praise the Jewish people as God's sort of beloved. And likewise, the prophet Malachi ends with this beautiful image that from the east and to the west, all peoples worship God and raise pure incense to God. In other words, it's a biblical text like this Zephaniah and Zechariah texts are that imagine a future when all people will worship God together in purity. And yet the rabbis are also saying, but don't worry, we'll still always be special to God. And so I guess this is where I'm going to end up. We've got about 10 more minutes for conversation. So I just want to encourage anybody else who would like to share, which is to say, to what extent is our self-image dependent on being different versus our self-image just being that we're devoted to God? And if other people are devoted to God in a similar way, how wonderful. How big is our heart to allow that other people will also be righteous and will also be considered God's people? And to what extent do we, to be honest, consider that a little bit threatening and want to continue to be sort of in a big world where it's really just us and God who are the lovers, and everybody else is kind of off to the side as voyeurs. So that's the question. I would like to hear some comments, and then I've got a closing thought.
Thank you. All right, so let me share a few comments with you. A couple of comments together. So one person wrote, has history shown us as the people in between, born between Egypt and Mesopotamia, neither black nor white? I got actually a lot of comments about kind of this in-betweenness. Another person wrote, when Jews were marginalized in European ghettos, they were vulnerable. And when they were emancipated, they were vulnerable by anti-Semitism. Think of Dreyfus and Herzl. So there's a lot of comments about kind of dwelling in this in-between space and kind of comparing us to another once persecuted American minority. Pundits have said that the Irish were eventually accepted into America's melting pot when every family had an Irish origin person in the family tree. Is the same happening for Jews through intermarriage? So that's, bringing us right up to the present, how we are separate and still unknown by many Americans, and yet very much blended into American society, including people of means, people of leadership. Those are just a few comments for you to respond to if you want to, or I can keep sharing comments.
Well, there's also something a little bit darker, which is that, maybe Irish Americans were accepted despite their Catholicism, when there were other people who were even more different to be discriminated against, and the Irish needed to be used as allies in suppressing other groups, whether it was Jews or, frankly, probably more likely Blacks. And it seems, and this isn't only in America or really anywhere, there's always going to be a totem pole. There's always going to be a hierarchy in society. And it even happens within Jewish society. You know, there was this great TV show in Israel back in the 70s and 80s, Shibalula, I think it was called. And one of my favorite skits showed like the first, it was like there was a Sephardic group of Jews that when the Ashkenazim started to show up in the late 19th century, the Jews who had been there for centuries were making fun of them. Then, you know, you had the German Jews were there, or the Russian Jews were there, and they made fun of the Polish Jews, and the Polish Jews made fun of each group that showed up next, the Moroccan Jews, the Yemenite Jews, and so on. Each group had to sort of suffer for being the newcomers and to be out of power. And so that can happen, you know, within societies, even within religious groups, even within ethnic groups, that there can be, you know, an up and a down. I think the healthy response for us is to create some sort of a sense of universal rights. I think that's where we are at our best as a Western society. And then to say that distinctive ethnic and religious values should be considered enhancements, you know, that they, and I think that has been the essence of liberal Jewish identities, to say there's no conflict between being an American who believes in free speech and free religion and free association for all Americans, right? And being a proud Jew who says, and I'm going to use those freedoms to explore my own family and faith identity. And at our best, that all works, but we're not always at our best. And I think we have to be on guard that sometimes our sense of distinctiveness, it's not just that it's perceived by others as exclusive, but that it really is exclusive and superior in many other ways. And I know that we Jews have an obligation, I believe, to be on guard to when people say knowing things to us. And, you know, as a rabbi, I've been surprised sometimes people will assume that, you know, I'm such a Jewish nationalist that I don't mind saying terrible things about other groups of people. And they almost feel like I'm safe to say things like that too. And I'm not safe to say things like that too. I want to remind them that Judaism is a religion which at its best, and we're not always at our best, is teaching us to see all humans as created in the divine image. And to say that there should be one rule for you and for the stranger in your midst. And by that, it means that we have to be on the lookout for our neighbors. And we shouldn't do it out of a sort of obsequious, pathetic hope that if we can just prove how much we care about everyone else, that people will be nice to us. That shouldn't be it. We should do it out of a sense of integrity, that this is what we were designed for. This is what God wants of us. And it will be our ultimate source of strength if we can live with integrity and practice righteous and compassionate treatment of other people. That will be our source of strength, whether or not it gets rewarded and recognized by our neighbors. So I don't know, that's, I guess, my take. And in terms of, you know, the needs of other peoples, you know, I know there's been a lot of activism around Black Lives Matter in the Jewish community. There's also been a lot of pushback about it. And I don't want to get into political territory, except to say that we do owe it to ourselves to look with open eyes at the realities of how other peoples around us are living. And if there's a gap in wealth, if there's a gap in health, if there's a gap in treatment, if there's unequal treatment by the law or by those who enforce the law, by the police, if there's a sense that your skin color affects how you are treated and viewed by authorities, then we're not living in a society that reflects the best values that we have. Judaism pays almost no attention to skin color. And so why should we think that we should have an advantage or a disadvantage based on our skin color? And so I think we do owe it to our society and to ourselves, frankly, to try to make sure that this is a society which is egalitarian in every sense of the word, where people of different racial and ethnic and religious backgrounds all have the opportunity to live with dignity and prosperity. That's where we're going to have a strong America and a strong Jewish identity as well. That was my little sermon there for the end. Is there anything else, Rabbi Andelman, that you want me to share or you want to share with me with a few minutes left?
Well, someone was asking, I think appropriately, about kind of the way we set up the session. How does our history of marginalization impact how we relate to others who are marginalized? And I think, I think we've all seen that it can lead really in a couple of very different directions. But maybe you just want to comment directly on that question.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it has led in opposite directions, right? It's like a pressure on us, which can lead to an explosion of responses. So one response is to radical universalism, like the socialist and even communist response. After World War I, there was this civil war in the Ukraine, and a lot of Jews, felt that the communists were the ones who actually were promising an egalitarian society where everybody would be equal. And when they were defeated by the Ukrainian nationalists, they came after the Jews and said that you were loyal sons of Ukraine. You were actually joining into this universe. So that was not necessarily received well. On the other hand, sometimes we've responded to our marginalization by caring only about ourselves and by being very nationalistic. And sometimes that allows us to accomplish great things, but it also can then further isolate us. And so we can be very proud of Israel's strength in defending itself, but we know that that hasn't necessarily solved all of its issues of isolation on the global stage. I guess I would conclude this idea with the great statement of Hillel, in Pirkei Avot, which is that, Im einani li mili, if I'm not for myself, it'll be for me. V'kshani latzmi mani, but if I'm only for myself, what am I? And so I don't think we should assume that by not looking out for the Jews for our own needs, that someone else is going to look out for our needs. But we also shouldn't assume that if we only take care of ourselves, that will suffice, because that will actually corrupt our own sense of purpose in the world and ultimately weaken us as well. So that's my thought. Anything else there?
You just made me think about this program that we're hosting on Wednesday, which I hope people.
It looks great. Yeah.
It's about, what can we learn from Holocaust reparations, about the conversation about reparations for slavery and Jim Crow and racism in America. And I think until recently, and maybe even now for a lot of people, that question is hard. How can you put the Holocaust in the same sentence as anything else? And I think it's an example of what you were just saying, right? It can engender, our past victimization can engender a desire to, empathy and see how we can help, and also just a sense of that we're unique in our suffering.
Yeah, I'm very interested in that program. It looks great. So hopefully I can also log on Wednesday night. Of course, reparations are for African Americans is the main focus, but we shouldn't forget the First Nations and the Native Americans as well. And the current issue of the Atlantic talks about turning over the national parks to the Native peoples as a type of reparation, because about 90 million, as I recall, acres were stolen from First Peoples and treaty violations. And so there's about 85 million acres of national park land, which perhaps could be administered by the First Peoples as a way of respecting their connection to the earth. But in terms of the theft of lives and labor from African Americans, Africans, and then African Americans to over 4 centuries, and Jim Crow and all that, I think that, yes, we certainly should be thinking about ways that our group experience and our individual experience can be instructive. And I know we're out of time and it's a big topic, so I'm not going to say much more, but I have thoughts, which is to say that certainly people who have suffered an individual loss are owed an individual reparation. The question is whether people who have, as a group, suffered are owed individual reparation, or is there a way to have a group reparation of some sort? In other words, an investment in the resources of their community. Much as like after the Holocaust, the state of Germany paid reparations, individual reparations, to people who were themselves victims of the Holocaust, but they also paid more of like a group reparation to the Jewish community of Germany by investing in schools and synagogues, or to the state of Israel itself. And it could be that that might be part of the answer here, that people who have themselves suffered immediate discrimination are owed reparation, but that communities of color that have suffered from neglect and from discrimination might deserve a collective type of investment by the government in their flourishing. So I don't know, maybe there's something there that can be applied.
I think we'll be talking about that and much more on Wednesday, which is the program is at noon Eastern. But in the meantime, I just want to thank you so much, Rabbi Nevins, for teaching us today. And you brought this series to a close in a beautiful way, and kind of really crystallizing what is at the essence of what we've been doing all semester, about kind of our special status, our not special status, how we conceptualize all of this, and how it makes us look outward, how the ways in which we've been seen and seen ourselves, how it makes us see others. So thank you so much for ending this series for us. Thank you to everyone for joining us for this series. I'm putting a link in the chat to our donation page if you are inspired to give as a result of this learning. And we want to thank again the Palex for sponsoring today. And we look forward to much more learning with you on Mondays and on many other occasions with all of our online learning programs. We wish everyone a good Shavuot coming up, a good couple of weeks off, and then we will see you again, we hope, on Monday, June 7th. Thanks again for joining us. Thanks again to Rabbi Nevins for teaching us today.